If you've been enjoying our Trans People in History series, then I've got good news for you. I found a big one. And strangely, while tonight's tale does deal with history, it's also about current events. Buckle up. Good news starts right now. In 1996, Dr. Zoe Playden and her legal team brought a judicial review case before the UK courts. They'd compiled a vast quantity of historical information showing that trans people had been able to correct our own birth certificates as a matter of course, without question in the past. The argument was that it was a matter of natural justice, if not common sense, that we ought to be able to do the same today. She was right, but they still lost the case, and nobody could tell them why. There was a reason, of course, but no one could tell them, for the same reason their judicial review hadn't turned up the obstacle that they couldn't see. Something had happened sometime in the late 1960s, and nobody involved was allowed to ever admit this invisible case had even existed. There was, however, one case that touched on trans issues that was very public, that took place shortly after the mysterious events blocking Zoe's efforts in the present, the 1970 ruling in Corbett versus Corbett. For those of you too young to remember, that was a case involving an English lord who married a trans woman, knowing perfectly well her medical history, which was no big deal at the time, and not a legal barrier either. You may recall the story of Bridget Bond, who was briefly engaged to an English noble in 1966. Her transness was not only public knowledge, but part of her fame, and the only reason her engagement had to be called off was because of a legal requirement that her betrothed must produce an heir. A sterile cis woman would have hit the same roadblock. The case of the Corbetts wasn't like that. The couple were married in 1963, and Lord or no, neither the courts nor the church had any problem at all with the bride being a trans woman. As Dr. Playden noted, in the past, trans people had full equality insofar as they had the same rights and recognition as any other member of their gender. A trans man could get credit in his own name without question. A trans woman would lose that ability the moment she made her status official. Things were not equal, only that trans people were fully accepted as the gender they were, with no hesitation or reservation by literally anyone. You might be surprised to learn that the world didn't end, sports didn't implode, and women weren't erased from existence. For literally hundreds of years, nobody cared. And there were no problems because of it. Trans people were just there. Banal. Almost boring. But I do digress. The Corbett marriage had broken down, and by 1967, Lord Corbett needed a way to divorce his wife, April. The options at the time were rather limited. There wasn't any no-fault divorce or long-term separation or irreconcilable differences. He couldn't prove infidelity, so he needed a way to annul the whole thing. What made the case famous is the way he went about that. He argued that in spite of the weight of centuries of legal precedent, a trans woman ought to be considered a male for the purposes of marriage. Since a male couldn't be married to a male at that time, his marriage had to be invalid. The judge in the case heard from a number of experts and determined that there are 3 factors, what he called biological criteria, that determine sex in a legal context, specifically with regards to marriage. Those biological criteria were chromosomes, gonads, and genitals. As nobody had ever checked Mrs. Corbett's karyotype, very few brides ever do this even today, the point of chromosomes was no help. Things went downhill from there. Being post-sex reassignment, Mrs. Corbett had no gonads at all, removing that element from consideration, and she had the genitals of a female. The only thing the court could consider by its own determination was solidly in favor of April's legal femininity. Determined to serve Lord Corbett's will, however, the judge had to get a little creative. According to Dr. Pladen, His Honor seized on the fact Mrs. Corbett was trans and used that to simply declare her mentally ill. That meant she was therefore not competent to enter into a marriage contract, and as she had been trans throughout the entire marriage, the whole thing was null and void. Yeah, he ignored his own criteria, and in doing so set a precedent that effectively stripped thousands of people of rights they had enjoyed for generations without any problems. Stripped them of the soundness of their very minds from a legal perspective overnight. Worse, that decision became a super precedent, being cited in cases internationally and for years to come. From the United States to Australia to South Africa, dozens of countries jumped right on board. So, what the hell happened? Why did the judge set aside the criteria he'd gone to all the trouble to determine just to hand down a ruling clearly outside the scope of the information and evidence? What caused this sudden shift in the way the law was motivated to view trans people? To answer that, we have to go a little farther back in time to the trans man whose story I'd set out to tell when I found myself sucked into this vortex of mystery and intrigue. Meet Sir Ewan Forbes. Born September 6th, 1912, he was an accidental Scottish noble, an intentional physician, and a lifelong trans man. In early childhood, he rejected all things feminine and preferred the company of his cousins Patrick and David to that of his sisters. He dressed as a boy unless forced to do otherwise, and he went to extreme lengths to avoid those occasions. As the youngest, he stood no chance to inherit, but had always wanted to become a physician, a healer, a person who could help people like him have an easier time than he was having. However, he refused to go to boarding school, where he'd be compelled to live as a girl, and so his mother arranged for tutors to school him at home. So things went throughout his childhood. Like parents of trans kids today, his mother was concerned about the possibility her son might be forced to go through the wrong puberty. When he turned 15, she conspired with him to nominally find a pre-university course he could attend overseas so that he could study as a male, but in reality, they would tour some of the continental medical facilities that today we would call gender clinics. Together, they traveled to Dresden, Prague, Vienna, and Paris. Not only did he find hormone therapy, first widely available in 1920, but he did obtain an education as well. During his years abroad, besides becoming well-rounded academically and picking up several languages along the way, he also studied the harp at the Paris Opera, became a public reciter of poetry, and thanks to his smooth, deep voice, landed a recording contract to read some famous verses, and he eventually found himself leading a troupe of dancers that, owing to a mostly female membership, required many women to adopt male roles for performances. That was an especially clever solution to a problem Ewan sometimes faced. As a member of high society, he was expected to dress as a woman for social events. As a member of the dance troupe, however, he got away with wearing the garb of a woman who happened to be dressed as a man for the legitimate purposes of dance performance. By 1933, he was studying psychology in Munich. He was there for the nationalist seizure of power, the subsequent post hoc elections, and the violent purge of the leftist partisans that would foreshadow the extreme violence yet to come in Germany. Fortunately, he didn't stay much longer, because, unfortunately, in 1934, his father passed, and while his elder brother William inherited the family's titles and lands generally, the late lord did leave a sizable estate to Ewan, who returned home to be a laird, rocking a kilt 24/7 and using his command of languages to overemphasize the Doric twang of the North. He was quite happy in this life for several years, but still hadn't fulfilled his childhood dream of becoming a physician. So in 1939, he went back to school, locally so that he could mind the farm at the medical school of the University of Aberdeen. He graduated in 1944, helped the Army finish up the war, then opened a general practice in 1945. He also found himself the proud surrogate of a gaggle of German POWs. Since he was a registered physician, an officer, and spoke their language, his assistance in the post-war years was of great service to the Crown. In 1952, he had a mind to get married to the co-leader of his old dance troupe, so he made his legal status official by simply requesting re-registration of his birth, updating both his name and sex. Because that's how it was done at the time. In her book about the subject, Dr. Pladen writes the typical process for trans people was, quote, take hormones, have gender confirmation surgery, and then change their birth certificates. There were no panels of psychiatrists and endocrinologists deciding whether to grant you a gender recognition certificate. There was no need. You could simply change your birth certificate, and from that, go on to update any other necessary paperwork. Ewan followed that path, and only as each step became necessary. The testosterone once he reached puberty, the legal paperwork only when it came time to marry, not even when he inherited. He didn't have to otherwise. He was simply accepted as the man he was. It's not known if he ever even bothered with surgery. And it all went just fine. That was until his brother William passed without offspring in 1965. As the only surviving child, both of his sisters having passed previously, Ewan stood to inherit all the family's titles. However, a cousin named John noticed that one title, a baronetcy, included a primogeniture requirement, meaning it could only be passed to a male heir. If John could render Ewan's claim to male status invalid, then John would stand to inherit. At William's funeral, John confronted Ewan and told Ewan that he'd challenge the succession because Ewan wasn't a real man. Now, until the mid-1960s, doctors largely regarded trans people as intersex, as what was evident at the time and continues to become increasingly evident as medical technology advances. We undeniably have physiological characteristics of both sexes. As with other intersex people, until that period, physicians were typically content to let us inform them of where we belonged and provide what support they could. But along came these American psychiatrists, particularly an arrogant hotshot by the name of John Money. That's a name you've probably heard. He's the guy infamous for advising one couple to raise one of their twin sons who, due to a botched circumcision, had an irreparably damaged penis as a girl. The Reimer twins. Yes, there is the dangerous permanent genital mutilation on kids who can't consent. Circumcision. It turns out the transphobes don't actually care about kids either. Are you surprised? So, Money's hypothesis was that gender was entirely based on social conditioning. Nothing biological, neurological, anything else. It's just how we're raised, exclusively, according to him. He could have falsified that idea by studying any of the trans people who had lived very publicly that we've covered on this channel, but he wanted to do his own experiment. As all who know this story are all too aware, John Money was wrong. David Reimer insisted he was a boy until the age of 14 when his therapist advised his parents to just tell him the truth. When they did, David expressed great relief, as having everyone in his life tell him he was delusional and was clearly a girl made him think he was crazy. The experiment and other things John Money had done had left irreparable psychological damage, however, and both brothers ended up self-deleting a couple of years apart later in life. The vile experiment with the Reimer twins proved that one's sense of gender is innate, and no matter how many people tell you otherwise, no matter what your biology seems to indicate, you feel what you feel. Contrary to popular belief, Money and his cronies didn't invent the concept of trans people. They were out to reclassify us as mentally ill. Despite being wrong about the innate nature of gender, wrong about the effectiveness of conversion therapy, wrong about psychosis, delusion, and everything else Money and his colleagues tried while they gleefully ignored the physical differences medical researchers had been aware of for generations, they still managed to influence the field in incredibly destructive ways, many of which are still plaguing us to this day. Ewan's cousin John happened to know John Money and his ilk, and was convinced he could use Money's ideas in court to prove that Ewan was a fraud as a man, that he was mentally ill, and that his marriage, on the theory that Ewan was not male, was an actual crime. He'd be imprisoned. He'd be struck from the medical register. His marriage would be erased. Ewan stood to lose everything. At first, Ewan offered to give John all the estates just to keep his own life and be left alone. That wasn't enough for John. So, Ewan fought. He used his family's name. He used his knowledge of physical medicine. He probably used dirty tricks. I'm waiting for another book to come in to learn about the details here, but the outcome is Ewan won. But Cousin John had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to catastrophe. You see, in the United Kingdom, nothing matters more than succession. Not a Scottish lord's life, not even a publicly beloved princess's life, and certainly not a few thousand commoners. So what if one northern lord happened to be a trans man? No big deal, right? Well, what if the Prince of Wales came out as a trans woman? The crown was also subject to primogeniture at the time, so maleness was of critical importance to the stability of the entire government. For very stupid reasons, but still, there it was. What would happen if a crown prince's older sister came out as a trans man and put herself ahead of the heir apparent in the succession? You, being a sensible person, might come to the sensible conclusion that simply doing away with the ridiculous rule of primogeniture would solve the problem. But because you're a sensible person, you're forgetting something very important. Patriarchy. Sexism isn't sensible, but men who will do anything to possess power don't really care about that. Ewan had won his case and went on to live happily ever after, but the peerage was terrified. To rectify the situation as best they could, whilst in the midst of an existential panic, they directed that the case be sealed, hidden, and its very existence denied, and all involved were sworn to total secrecy. Nobody must ever know. Not ever. The second step was to delegitimate trans people so that a similar problem could never crop up again. So the following year, the aristocracy invited Dr. John Money to come to London for the first international symposium on gender identity. By the following year, when the Corbett case was decided, the psychiatrists at the NHS had overruled the physicians and decided that being trans, like being homosexual, was probably a mental illness. And they were just getting started with working out the therapies to cure us. In the years to come, trans people would be subject to horrors beyond measure, from the actual torture of aversion therapy to forced sterilization and more. And they endured it because, as bad as all that was, being forced to live as someone you aren't is worse. Much of that is still hanging over us today, along with a sizable chunk of the public who continues to view us as mentally ill, as sexual threats, or as subhuman. In many places, we can still be fired or evicted with no notice or reason. In 30 U.S. states, we can be murdered, and as long as our killers say they were trans, they stand a good chance of getting a reduced sentence or getting off entirely. It didn't used to be that way. It doesn't have to be this way. But almost nobody knows the real history of why it is this way, because the story was hidden very deliberately by very powerful people. To this day, a motion is proposed in the English Parliament to remove primogeniture from inheritance law almost every year. And every time it is brought to a vote, it is killed immediately. As much as things have changed, the patriarchy, which supports the hierarchy that keeps the aristocracy on top, will not allow even the chance of women entering their club. Ewan's case remained sealed until after his death in 1991, and for years later until the primogeniture rule for the crown was changed. And even after that, Dr. Pladen had to beg, borrow, and pull several political strings to gain access to even partial records. She spent years digging and was only able to publish the first record of what happened to Ewan Forbes in 2021. That is the book I have on order. This complex web of scandal and genocide is just the tip of the iceberg. The information I've presented tonight comes from scraps of articles, public talks, and offhand mentions, and other fragmentary sources I've put together the best I can. So, friends, now you know a lot more than you probably bargained for this evening. And maybe the world looks a little darker than it had before you tuned in. But the good news is this. There is a saying, a lie can make it around the world before the truth even gets its boots on. But there is another saying that rather goes along with that. No matter how long it takes, the truth will get out. As journalists, that's kind of our thing. If you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe. Support our work by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TheTransPositions and reap heaps of benefits. Our meme of the week was posted by Maya Adkisson. And if you want to ridicule the basic biology bandwagon, join us on Discord. Also, if you have good news concerning trans people you'd like to see reported on, you can tell us about it in the Discord as well. For the Transpositions, I've been Ember Belrad.